Yeah, hi everyone. Let me just get this shared here.
And I think, we decided to talk about the New York scoping plan. I know it's New York specific, but I think as David mentioned earlier, and I think Lauren had mentioned too, the New York scoping plan we think is going to be somewhat of a blueprint for other states as well. So I think there is a lot in it that is telling about where we're headed.
Yeah, thanks, Abu. Can you see the presentation presenting in presentation mode, I guess?
We've got it.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. So I mentioned before, I am Lauren Ray, Ag Sustainability and Energy Engineer with Cornell ProDairy program. For anyone who's not familiar with the ProDairy program, we're housed at Cornell University within the Animal Science Department in College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. And we provide education and applied research to advance the dairy industry in New York State. Within ProDairy, we're a small team, but I'm part of the Dairy Environmental Systems program, which is focused on environmental systems related aspects of the dairy farming or dairy industry. And so that has, historically included water quality impacts, as well as now, more on the manure management side and greenhouse gas emissions related to manure management in particular. So we'll talk about the New York State Climate Law Scoping Plan. It's a 445-page document, so I will tell you I have not read every word in that document, but have done my best to find the parts that are most important to the discussion we're having today and to the dairy industry in New York. So first, just for some baseline, New York State, this is showing you the greenhouse gas emissions in New York State by sector. And the wheel diagram here is a little fuzzy, but just some things to point out. Firstly, that agriculture makes up just 6% of the total New York State greenhouse gas emissions. And of that, the dairy industry or the dairy agriculture portion of that is over 5%. So it is the majority of that 6% associated with agriculture emissions. You see, though, that is obviously a small portion compared to things like the waste sector. We've got predominantly landfills contributing methane significantly in New York State to the greenhouse gas emission total. We have electricity generation, which has actually been shrinking already, and then transportation and buildings are the other two very large greenhouse gas emission contributors. So let's focus in on agriculture and specifically livestock greenhouse gas emissions in New York State. Again, so this is showing you a breakdown of that 6% essentially. So and we see that livestock, as I mentioned, really makes up the majority, and animal feeding would be associated with the enteric fermentation methane emissions coming from livestock. So those have stayed fairly steady, a little bit of increase from 1990 levels to where we are today. But you see really a large increase in the manure management greenhouse gases, and that is from 1990 levels to where we are today. And that's really because we've had a shift from water quality best management practices to storing manure liquid slurry long term, right, to allow it to have the right application of nutrients to the land base. So through those practices that are, again, for water quality best management, we now have rising greenhouse gas emissions really from manure management in New York State, and that needs to be mitigated. So the New York State Climate Law, many of you are familiar with that now. It's referred to as the CLCPA, Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, and it has several requirements under the law. These four are very important. 70% renewable electricity by 2030. So the electricity grid will have 70% renewable sources by 2030, just 7 years away, I guess now. 100% zero emission electricity by 2040. So now the electricity grid by 2040 needs to be 100% zero emission. And I put a question mark there because the definition of zero emission is not explicitly in the law. And even in the scoping plan, it's pointed out that that zero emission needs to be defined. So it is not, it's not defined. And under the law or the scoping plan, they say we will define that going forward. So we have yet to find out exactly what zero emission means. 40% reduction of 1990 greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. So that again, 7 years, huge reduction required. And we're going to need aggressive technology development to meet that target. 85% reduction of 1990 greenhouse gases by 2050. Again, very aggressive, but a little bit longer term to reach that. And the scoping plan is really designed to lay out the pathways and the technologies under each sector that need to be developed in order to hit that 85% reduction by 2050, as well as the 40% by 2030. So I think what's pretty interesting in the scoping plan is the different scenarios. There's 3 of them that have been proposed and shown, really modeled to be pathways of how New York State can reach that total 85% reduction of greenhouse gases by 2050. And these are those 3 scenarios. And I think, again, I'm not sure what happened to scenario 1. Maybe that's business as usual. We fail. I'm not sure, but it's thrown out. So I think it would be entertaining if anyone has any kind of initial thoughts as they look at these 3 scenarios. Feel free to kind of jump in and let us know if you have anything kind of jumps out at you. I can't actually see anyone, so I'm just going to listen.
No, I think this is still to be determined, right, Lauren? But the thing that's in bright light is electrification. That's the main criteria here. Is that how you're reading it too?
Yeah, so I guess you're looking at those green bars there, right? Clean electricity is very high. This is really the level of transformation or development that we need in each of these kind of spaces here on the left. And so each of the scenarios requires very high development and transformation of clean electricity. So yes, I see that as basically that's required. Good point. Anything else?
Again, I'd say also like the emissions mitigation in agriculture and waste is high throughout, regardless of if it's low carbon fuels or electricity or, towards zero emissions vehicles. Yeah, that's a big basis and starting point.
Yeah, so down there in the orange bars, we see the emissions mitigation from agriculture and waste. We need to have that transformation occur at a high or very high level through all these scenarios. And I think the question becomes, how will that be done, right? There's different technologies that can be used. We probably need them all, but I think one of the biggest things that I noticed while looking at this is that we have some very different options, or I guess each of these scenarios has a different case for low carbon fuels that's being looked at, right? So in scenario 2, it's showing high development of low carbon fuels, but scenario 3 has low development because that one's really focused on completely transitioning away from combustion, which low carbon fuels generally are used in a combustion format, although they don't have to be. And scenario 4 then shows a medium level of development there. So I think what struck me when I looked at these also was that scenario 2 looks pretty balanced. It's showing high development in all of the sectors here, or the areas. Clean electricity is very high, but each of them is sort of balanced. So to me, it's a bit more of a balance, and also maybe requires less aggressiveness in any one of those areas, aside from the clean electricity. And I think the other interesting thing is if you look at the bottom, you've got negative emission technologies. And really that is referring to things like direct air capture of carbon dioxide. That's what they mean by those negative emissions technologies. And as of now, there's really no workable solutions or technologies in that space. So I think that's why scenario 4 was looked at, because that would be a case where none of those negative emission technologies would be needed, and we could still reach that total greenhouse gas emission reduction. But now you see that every area requires very high transformation of the way they're doing things now, essentially, or development to reach that 85% reduction. And low carbon fuels is used at a medium level rather than a high or very high level. And I'm curious whether scenario 4 could maybe lessen some of these very high requirements if low carbon fuels were used at a higher level. So just some of the things to think about as the state rolls along under these pathways. So what I think what we're seeing is obviously a way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, especially for the transportation and the buildings sector, is to reduce fossil fuel use, right, in those sectors. And the way to do that, or kind of the natural thought process, is, well, let's see how we can electrify those, because we have a clean electricity grid in New York State already, especially upstate. And that's really because of hydropower and nuclear, right, that are the dominating sources, and then clean burning natural gas as well. So how can we, provide more electricity based heating systems for our homes and electricity vehicles, right, to offset those greenhouse gas emissions that we have today? So the overall scoping plan is really saying we've got to electrify as much as possible, but we also need that clean electric grid, right? And so this is from the New York ISO that is showing how we could reach the 2040 100% zero emission electricity grid that is actually supplying what they expect will be needed in 2040 based on moving more vehicles, passenger vehicles first to electricity or to electric vehicles, and then even residential heating systems. And so what we would do in that case is we would shift to a winter peak as far as where the electricity grid would reach a peak load would actually be in the winter. So they're showing this concept here of where does our electricity have to be coming from in this winter peaking type of scenario in 2040. So I won't focus in on each of these, but you see contributions from nuclear still, of course, from hydropower, as well as solar and wind being very significant as far as needing to grow that resource in order to supply clean electricity that we need to meet the overall 70% by 30 goal, and then this zero emission by 2040. But what stands out, or what we should focus in on, is this literal gray area. They actually made it gray, and it's called they need 10% to come from dispatchable emissions-free resources. And those are not explicitly defined, but what could be an emissions-free or a net negative emissions type of resource, not fossil-based, right? That's dispatchable. Well, anaerobic digestion. That could certainly fit that role, and I think we'll need to fit that role because, again, 10% is going to need to come from those types of resources. So with anaerobic digesters, of course, we can generate electricity in several ways. Engines are commonly used because of their lower cost, and really the historical use has proven their robustness in this environment. There's also gas turbine technology and fuel cells as well. So the fuel cell picture there is from Bloom Energy and their installation that's at Bar 20 Dairy in California. And so that is a fuel cell running on biogas from a digester, solid oxide fuel cell. I do want to point out I have a biogas utilization fact sheet that can help you look at these different technologies and sort of start to compare them as you're looking at electricity generation. Biogas utilization there on our website. So, and the good news also is the scoping plan in New York State does define biogas and renewable energy very clearly. So you can read that. It's page 56. I won't let you do that now, but so that's good. And they differentiate that from fossil natural gas. So they define fossil natural gas as well. But they are also very clear within the scoping plan in several sections that there are going to be some key requirements in order to use biogas and RNG. And those are primarily that they need to be screened for lower overall co-pollutant emissions than petroleum fuels. So they need to provide lower co-pollutant emissions than the alternative fossil fuels that they're replacing. And co-pollutants would be particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, NOx, sulfur oxide, right? So they're saying it's very important that if we use biogas and RNG, and especially combusting those, that we are able to show we can keep the co-pollutants reduced compared to alternatives. So keep that in mind. Also the second requirement would be that there are rigorous guidelines and metrics for life cycle greenhouse gas benefits. So they do want to use really like a carbon intensity type of scoring or accounting to ensure that the life cycle greenhouse gas benefits of biogas are being shown to be better than or to really provide the greenhouse gas reductions that they're looking for. So that's going to be part of the picture. So several of the sections or the chapters in the scoping plan that focus on different areas or sectors in New York State talk about that same idea of those key requirements for biogas and RNG use. So agriculture and forestry section, first of all, has a plan to achieve 30 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent reduction by carbon storage and sequestration by 2030. And then that same requirement reaching 60% or 60 million metric tons by 2050. So that's overarchingly what the agriculture and forestry sector is signed up to achieve to contribute to overall reductions. Specifically under manure management, though, within that section, they talk about the use of covering and flaring manure storages, right? So just putting a cover and having the gas flared that might be generated from manure storage, but also the opportunity for anaerobic digestion, using biogas on site, though, being a preference over upgrading to RNG and having it distributed out. And so there is a preference for on-site use or generation, I guess, of energy. And composting and other solutions that we may not even know today. Just to point out, the waste sector talks about a lot of things obviously related to waste, but the food diversion law that New York State has, it's in place as of January last year, 2022. And so that is, again, I think someone mentioned this, but really follows the food recovery hierarchy as far as you need to find opportunities to food waste generators need to find opportunities to feed people, then feed animals, and then look for industrial uses that can provide energy as well as recover the nutrients in the food as well, preferably. Now that section does talk a lot about WRRFs, which some of you may know that acronym, but it's wastewater recovery, water resource recovery facilities, I think is the official term, essentially referring to wastewater treatment plants that can take in other wastes, for example, food waste, right, and can also anaerobically digest those along with municipal wastewater. So I think what's important here is, they spent a lot of time in that section talking about these water resource recovery facilities. I think, they didn't ignore the fact that agriculture can certainly play a role and have anaerobic digestion, both of manure as well as food waste. What becomes important there is how will the effluent be handled, right? How can we, what's the best way to recycle nutrients to the land base and do that appropriately and safely? So that's going to be important to consider here. And again, the waste section did talk about the use of biogas on site being preferred over RNG. And then finally, there's a chapter on the gas system transition, and that is really all discussing the need to downsize the natural gas grid, again, to focus on reducing the use of fossil gas and to instead expand the electricity grid in New York State and to build that out to be able to handle all of the renewable and zero emission electricity sources that they need to then electrify buildings and heating systems and vehicles as much as possible. So that's very clear. They do mention the strategic role for RNG and hydrogen, of course, being in the picture there, but with the overall goal to really downsize that grid. So again, all of these things you should keep in mind as you're kind of looking at the future, really especially the long-term future that New York State is headed. And then I do want to just end with a couple of important points that I think many of us maybe have heard, especially within New York State. I know there's been a lot of discussions on this, but there's some criticism of anaerobic digestion. And the two key points that are typically discussed are that digester systems leak methane and actually do so egregiously. They can make the greenhouse gas problem worse. And then the second one I think we hear is there just isn't enough biogas to replace the natural gas demand. It would only amount to maybe 2 to 8% of what we're using. So should we even bother, right? Maybe you've heard these, but I have. So I just want to spend a little time on these because I think, it's really important to be informed when people are making these statements, to understand like what do we know about leakage from methane or leakage of methane from anaerobic digester systems. So this is actually some work that came out of Denmark. They have several biogas plants that are anaerobic digesters generating renewable natural gas, some electricity. And so this, there's actually a published peer-reviewed paper that shows some of this data that I have cited at the bottom. But this is really ongoing work that they have to measure the actual leakage from biogas plants. And just to draw your attention to really what they're finding on the right is they're finding a leakage of methane that's about, on average, 4%, 4.5%. And you see it does vary. So they have centralized agricultural plants. They have measured to be just under 2% of an emissions of leakage from those plants. Farm scale plants, a little bit higher on average, about 4% or just under 4%. You see wastewater treatment plants, actually they found had the highest average leakage. And so what's interesting with their work, just to keep in mind, is that they're able to do this type of leak measurement pretty easily because most all of those plants are sited sort of independently. So the biogas plant is not kind of on site with a farm operation. They don't have barns with animals that are generating methane themselves, right? Or storage of other, maybe manure. And so I think what they're able to do is really isolate these facilities and then are able to measure any emissions that are coming from them that are not being contained. right, as they should be, the methane should be, in order to use it for energy. So it's pretty easy for them to do these types of total site leakage measurements, whereas that's not really the way that we have our system set up so far in New York State or many of the states in the US. So just keep that in mind. I think also when we talk about leakage of methane, we should be aware that that is accounted for in the project greenhouse gas emissions. This is showing you a table that is all the components of California's LCFS carbon intensity score that Dave spoke obviously a lot about. And this is a way of accounting for greenhouse gas emissions associated with the total project. So I won't really spend time going through all these. You can look at our report and fact sheets that we have on this topic that do describe all of this in as much detail as you'd like to read. But what we want to point out is, these projects, this is an example that we modeled for a New York State dairy AD to RNG project. And digester leakage and leakage as well of methane from the biogas upgrading are included in that carbon intensity score. And each of them is actually a fixed by CARB input of 2% leakage. And so you see that that's 2%. The units here in grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per megajoule of fuel that's produced. That's the carbon intensity score unit. But just the important thing is that there's 2% associated with the digester itself and 2% associated with the upgrading of biogas to RNG. And that's a loss that you must include in that score. So I think, that's in there. And you see we still end up with a negative total carbon intensity score from anaerobic digester systems taking dairy manure. And that's what Dave explained as well. But I want to just point out, what if we were to consider that the leak rate was actually 5 times greater? So in that case, if we multiplied each of those leakages by 5, we would have a total of a 20% leakage from this system. And we would still have a negative carbon intensity associated with that fuel generation. And compare that to diesel's carbon intensity, which is about 90 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per megajoule. So I think the point here is that we don't want leakage, we need to minimize it, but we also know that these projects are actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions even with leakage, at potentially a large amount as well. So keep that in mind. And then finally, the criticism that there isn't enough biogas to replace natural gas, so is it really worth it? And I just want to point out that Denmark has, as I mentioned before, has been on this path, and many other European countries as well, has been on a path to generate, energy from bio sources. And what they have found is that, they've been focused on reducing their use of natural gas. So this chart is showing you, with really the red dashed line, what the system gas use is in Denmark. And you can see the natural gas portion has been decreasing, that's the darker green, and the biomethane portion has been increasing. And currently in 2023, about 1/3 of the gas usage is coming from biomethane in Denmark today. So I think, and they're projecting that by 2035, it will be close to 100% of the usage. Again, because they're reducing natural gas use as well as producing biomethane to then be part of that solution. So again, this is the kind of the pathway that can, I think, come together in New York State as well. And people I think the scoping plan allows for this. There is flexibility there. And, the good news is there is support also for anaerobic digestion that I think is kind of more and more recent. So Kathy Hochul at an event just this year did say, biodigesters, why isn't this something we're doing here? It makes sense. And as I mentioned, New York State does, Kathy Hochul has put into place now a 20% agricultural investment tax credit that went from 5%. I believe that that's fully approved. And then she has proposed that that becomes, or that is refundable for 5 years, but that is not yet approved. So we're waiting to see if that's approved in the state budget. So with that, I just want to end with, I believe we should use all the tools in our toolbox to solve for climate change. We're not going to really have an opportunity to do otherwise. So thank you, and this is our team. Feel free to reach out with any questions if we don't have enough time today.
Thanks so much, Lauren. We appreciate it. There's a lot to unpack there, and I know I just learned a lot in that as well. And thank you for providing some of that data. I know we're trying to push digesters, and we believe in biomethane, and we believe in agriculture, and I think that this is kind of the perfect marriage of sustainable agriculture, but then also trying to meet renewable energy goals of the country. So we appreciate you advocating for these types of projects as well. Any questions?
Lauren, I think this presentation was wonderful. I mean, I've read that 400-page scoping plan, but putting it succinctly like this, boy, we will be publicizing this, and hope you're okay with it. We plan to put snippets of our conversations today out so that more people can access it, even if they aren't here. But this was phenomenal presentation, a simplified way to explain where New York is heading. I guess my question to you is, what do you think? What are the differences between where New York's heading and where California is heading?
Well, so I think that I guess the main difference that I see is that, like Dave had mentioned, New York State has discussed or has planned for having a clean fuel standard or a fuel standard of their own. And that is talked about a little bit in the scoping plan, but we don't have details really on that, or it's not in place yet. But I think what we have seen is that clean fuel standard would emphasize the use of electricity. So the electric pathway is a big part of it, and that can certainly come from the biogas, right? Come from the bioenergy sources. And I see that as a pretty key difference from what California has set up with their fuel standard, where they've sort of allowed for maybe any technologies, and they have greenhouse gas accounting, set up that makes sense for a variety of fuels, but the electricity pathway has not been as emphasized, I guess, yet. So that might be, it's almost like New York State is sort of trying to jump to that instead of maybe something that other states and entities have already done in the past. If that makes sense. But the big focus being that greenhouse gas accounting is important, and certainly the way that California has done that under their fuel standard is a model for how it could work here, even if electricity is the ultimate use of that energy.
And the second one I think, Lauren, is nobody is emphasizing or de-emphasizing the natural gas infrastructure as much as New York has done. I think they're going to hear a lot of criticism on that, obviously, from all the folks, the utilities that support that. But that is another piece. I feel like, I don't know if they're going to actually be able to do it. But that's a big stark thing, isn't it?
Well, and there's a lot of a thing I didn't really mention, I guess, and this ties into the key requirements of using biogas and RNG that I mentioned, one of which is to make sure we're minimizing co-pollutants. So a big part of the scoping plan included working groups that focused on climate justice and a just transition to this, adoption of these climate strategies. And so through that, that's where you're getting, the emphasis on reducing co-pollutants and making sure that also there's a just transition away from gas and toward electricity that is not going to bring economic hardship. So I do think it's, a little uncertain kind of how quickly or how that will be implemented, but it is clear that electricity grid needs to expand and grow and the gas grid needs to shrink. At least that's New York State's strategy.
Okay. Paul, did you have something to say?
I don't know whether Deborah's still with us or not.
Yes, I'm here.
So we kind of I don't want to get sidetracked too much here. I think most of us on this meeting this morning, of course, obviously are concerned about renewable energy and reducing greenhouse gases. I actually like to think a little bit about the next step. And I believe that you said Live Oak financed that big project in Michigan that was on your slide. Well, not Michigan, in Wisconsin, the 16 digesters. I'm really interested and kind of excited about pursuing the dewatering part. That project in Wisconsin is making 400,000 gallons of clean water every day. Were you involved in that project, and does Live Oak embrace that next step?
I was not personally involved. I can't speak to the specifics very much of that program, but I mean, we are very committed to renewable energy projects, definitely. Live Oak is.
So, of course, the dewatering has very heavy, impact on the environment in terms of concentrating nutrients and less potential for runoff. I see that as the next step after we get the renewable energy part under our belt. We need to be thinking about what we're going to do with the liquid and the nutrients when we get done making the renewable energy.
Yeah, Paul, I think we should make that one of our educational series. Let's talk about where the technology is today and, let's understand the pros and the cons. I think that would be something we'll talk about internally in Agri Energy and how do we highlight the progress that we have made so far across all.
Okay.
So we'll look into that, Paul. We know exactly where the pain points are for our current projects, and that is a pain point right now.